Hi, my name is Daphne and Santiago, and
My name is Khalil Tan.
My name is Gabriel Soria.
My name is Kimberly Trujillo.
Hi, my name's Jasmine Singh.
Yeah, and this is our team presentation. Okay. So first off, we're doing modules 5 and 6 based off the team assignments. And some key points from the article and textbook are first, inclusive and extractive institutions. Essentially, an inclusive institution are used for economic equality, protection of property rights, and allows for equal participation. So essentially, everyone thrives. Extractive institutions are used to concentrate the power among the elites and gives the wealth only to the hands of a few by exploitation, which slows down innovation and overall growth. Now, some examples of this that were implemented, such as are the Battle of Bosworth, which was essentially an important catalyst to England's economic and political development because it removed any sort of conflict within the feudal system and made economic reforms towards inclusive institutions. When Henry Tudor defeated Richard III, the state became centralized and created a much stronger central government. Another example would be the Spanish and English colonies in the New World. They wanted to gain control of indigenous people and extract their economic surplus. They essentially were extractive institutions that had different approaches. First, the Spanish implemented the system called the encomienda system, in which Spanish colonists were given the right to collect tribute and forced labor from indigenous people and communities in exchange for protecting them and teaching them Christianity. In reality, it was a form of slavery. Then, for the English, rather than integrating indigenous people to the colonies, they pushed them off their land and exploited them of their homes. Another example would be the Industrial Revolution. It was significant for this class because it displayed multiple critical historical junctures, but we can get to that later, that helped England grow as an economy over time, which will expand further on what critical junctures are on the next slide. Some examples over history that we would see um, would be what happened after bubonic plague and how it greatly reduced the labor force and how completely changed the social dynamics, and also made way for more inclusive institutions and led to the end of feudalism, which was a fundamentally extractive system. Another example would be the Glorious Revolution of 1688, and how it helped with turning England from an extractive to a more inclusive institution by establishing constitutional monarchy and expanding the rights of the people by the parliament. Okay, you can switch the slide. Okay. And other key points would be critical junctures and institutional drifts. Critical critical junctures are significant changes in history triggered by external shocks or crises that lead to significant transformations in societies and institutions. And institutional drifts is when institutions' norms, functions, and practices change naturally or unintentionally over time. It's unplanned and just happens. Examples of this being implemented would be the Atlantic trade boom. It was seen as a critical juncture due to the rise of the transatlantic trade back in the 16th and 18th centuries, which dramatically increased the flow of wealth to Europe. This sudden change led to a significant transformation, such as the emergence of inclusive institutions, laying foundations for capitalism and created new economic elites, whom were people who began to challenge the power of the traditional aristocrats that followed extractive systems. Another example would be colonialism. Colonialism was just showing institutional drift through how colonizers changed the norms, functions, and practices by meaning to serve the interests of the homeland over the development of the colony. For example, European colonizers would set up extractive institutions to exploit labor and resources, and some unintended consequences as a result would lead to local elites inheriting these colonial institutions to maintain their own power and control of legal system, property rights, and political structures that were skewed toward the elites. Even after independence, it still persisted, creating income gaps, and then when constitutions or elections would be introduced, it would at times still drift of authoritarianism or even corruption. Conversely, in settler colonies, Europeans settled in large numbers and faced little disease or resistance and unintendedly would develop inclusive institutions.
Okay, so now we're going to go over what interventions could be made or could have been made to address and slash or improve the issues raised in the readings. So these are like our hypotheticals that increase inclusion in politics, empowering other and broad social groups, such as merchant classes, or even the indigenous people may have been able to accelerate institutional reforms in many regions. Then we have limiting extractive institutions, creating institutional limits on colonies or other authorities, and making required and legal protections for populations could create better growth for many places, such as the Congo or India, and make it more inclusive. Then interventions on health, creating a focus on lowering the mortality of settlers could have encouraged a more inclusive settler society over an extractive one. So what's currently happening is international programs for developments that create a focus on strengthening judicial independence, reducing corruption, and protecting property rights for the people, making education more accessible to create a pathway for building more inclusive institutions. Next slide. So how does this connect to economics and history? So we're going to talk about the economics is all about how societies allocate resources. The economy grows when more individuals can buy land, create businesses, or put money into schools. So inclusive institutions ensures that various people can productively contribute by owning their own land, starting their own business, and innovating more and more, leading to higher levels of investment, more entrepreneurship, and more economic growth. Whilst extractive institutions do to the opposite and concentrate on economic stagnation. So protection of property rights by inclusive institutions. Historical extractive institutions create perpetual gaps, such as wealth, education, infrastructure. And then we talk about, oh yeah, the protection of property rights by inclusive institutions allowed freedom to invest in whatever they wanted without fear of exploitation, whether it be businesses, land, or even education, which became a prerequisite for technological advancement and industrialization. Historical extractive institutions created perpetual gaps in wealth, education, infrastructure, like we just said, which we see in the modern day. And then we saw that events like the Glorious Revolution, the Black Plague, and Atlantic trade boom were seen as critical junctures as an institutional direction of nations. And then colonialism also helped structure legal systems, labor policies, and governance models. That usually still exists even after independence. For example, you have the Congo with exploitive state systems, and places like the US with rule of law based governance.
Our next slides is module 7 and 8, or what are the key points from the textbook and articles. The main point of the evolution of the slave trade was that are the religious justifications and the racial ideologies that went through the Spanish and English extensions, along with the decline of the labor sources. The main point of the aftermath of the slave trade and the dual economy is that it refers to the coexistence of two different economic systems that happen in the same country, to which we see that it is an extractionary system because of the labor exploitation that we see that takes place. The main point of economics of the Dutch East India Company and the tactics that they use was that they were able to achieve the economic goals uh, that they aimed for and its significance to the entities of the early modern world. How it connects to economics and history. It's, the ratings connect to history and to economics because it shows how a country goes the economy in the early modern world, and it shows that the progress that they had to go through to see what worked for their economy and what did not work for their economy.
I will be talking about Module 10 and 11. What are the key points from the textbook and the article? So, one of these key points are based on the title on the roles and of the political and economic institutions. These roles shape the long-term national outcomes and emphasizes how history, policy, decisions, and institutional design intersect to affect development of such. An article that showcases this is Ottoman Empire's weak financial institutions and over-reliance on eternal debt contributed to its decline and its reputation as the sick person of Europe. This article showcases the empire's outdated agrarian tax system and its failure to modernize its revenue infrastructure, which left it vulnerable to European control. As the empire continuously borrowed from European lenders in the 19th century, its sovereignty was undermined and eventually was under financial supervision from foreign creditors. This shows how economic fragility, when paired with weak institutions, can lead to dependency and loss of autonomy, and how important it is for political and economic institutions to have such roles. So for the next one is economic growth alone does not lead to democracy. To give a background, the virtuous cycle is a positive feedback loop where one positive event leads to another, creating a cycle of success and improvement. Inclusive institutions reinforce one another, leading to innovation, investment, and long-term stability. According to the research of Acemoglu and Robinson, they're with other co-authors in Income and Democracy, they believe that it is the nature of political institutions, whether inclusive or extractive, that determines whether a country can sustain democratic development. In other words, this article showcases that societies with inclusive institutions, people tend to be empowered to hold leaders accountable, participate in markets freely, and trust in the fairness of the legal system. This leads to the concept of virtuous cycle from Why Nations Fail. Another one is the opposite discussion to the previous article is from the film The Star Chamber, where it presents a fictional example of what happens when institutions lose legitimacy. Judge Harden becomes involved in a secret court that bypasses legal procedures to punish criminals who escape justice through legal loopholes. This film showcases that even if the reason is well-intentioned, his vigilante approach undermines the rule of law and mirrors the historical abuses of Tudor-era Star Chamber, which is the Whigs criticized for its arbitrary rulings and the lack of due process. This connects to the virtuous circle concept, which stresses the legitimate, transparent institutions are essential for sustaining liberty and democracy.
Okay, what interventions could be made or could have been made to address and or improve the issues raised in the readings? Okay, interventions that could have been made. These include earlier reforms in Ottoman official policy, to modernize tax collection, reduce debt dependency, and then more strong efforts could be made to build inclusive political structures that give citizens voice and agency. So basically, it's what was discussed in the readings that include earlier reforms in the official policy to modernize tax collection, reduce debt dependency, and stronger efforts to build inclusive political structures that would basically like give citizens voices. And yeah, the reading just illustrated like connections between economic history and events that happened. And so ultimately, I would say that both economic development and democratic resilience don't just depend on wealth and growth, but also on the quality and inclusiveness. So yeah, those are like interventions. Okay, so how does this connect to economics and history? And then connections to economics and history. So this kind of like goes more into context of like the last slide. Modern economic choices do not happen out of thin air and are made and shaped through past institutional legacies, historical events, and power structures that were implemented back then. Both economical development and democratic resilience do not only depend on wealth and growth, but rather on the quality and inclusiveness of institutions that govern society. As I previously mentioned that. So basically, you would have to rely on like quality as well and like other things beyond just resilience and wealth. It's also about diversity, inclusiveness, and also like it comes down to who governs society ultimately.
And this is our works cited. Thank you so much for listening.